The night was cold, but inside the tall, bright building, warmth and music spilled from every corner. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, scattering light like diamonds over the crowd below. People laughed, clinked glasses, and moved through the room in elegant swirls of color and sound. The air smelled of perfume, expensive cologne, and a hint of fresh flowers. Everyone seemed to know someone. Everyone seemed to belong. Everyone except her. She stood near the doorway, her coat wrapped tightly around her, though it did nothing to hide how out of place she felt. She had not been invited for the laughter or the fancy dresses. She had not come for the champagne or the sparkling lights. She was there because she had to be, because someone asked her to come along, because she had nowhere else to be. The crowd did not notice her, at least not at first, and perhaps that was a mercy. She could watch quietly, blend into the background, and make herself small. She had learned long ago that the safest place for someone like her was where no one could see her. But that night, no matter how small she tried to be, she could feel the eyes. People glanced at her briefly, curious or amused, before returning to their sparkling conversations. Their looks carried questions she could not answer. Who is she? Why is she here? There was a coldness in some of the eyes, a subtle judgment that made her stomach twist. She pulled her coat tighter, wishing she could disappear entirely, wishing she could fade into the walls. She had always felt this way, even among people she knew well. She was used to being overlooked, brushed aside, treated as if she was less than. But this was different. This room, this party, was a world where everyone wore confidence like armor. Everyone seemed to belong naturally, without struggle or doubt. She had never felt so painfully aware of how much she did not belong. And yet, she had learned to move through the world without causing ripples, to walk quietly without making anyone look twice. She had perfected the art of invisibility. From her spot near the doorway, she could see the grand piano standing against the far wall. It was black and glossy, almost shining under the chandelier lights. It looked untouched, waiting for someone worthy to sit at it. She did not know why, but her eyes kept returning to it. It was as if the piano itself was calling her, inviting her to cross the room and touch its smooth surface. She shook her head. No, she told herself. Not here, not now. People would laugh. People would whisper. She was not the kind of person who could take that space, who could hold attention without apology. She had learned long ago that stepping forward often led to embarrassment, so she stayed where she was. Her hands stuffed into the pockets of her coat, feeling the heat of her own nervous energy. Around her, the party continued in full swing. Guests in tailored suits and elegant dresses moved in waves, forming small islands of conversation. Someone lifted a glass, and the clink of crystal rang sharply in the air. Laughter bubbled up from one group, high and musical, and she could not help but feel the divide between them and herself. They were shining and bright, and she was a shadow, barely noticed. A waiter passed by, carrying a tray of sparkling drinks. She watched the liquid shimmer in the glasses, the way the light bent and danced. She wondered who would take the first sip, what toast would be made, what clever joke would travel from one group to another. She had grown up on the outside of these kinds of moments, always watching, always waiting. And yet, a small part of her wanted to step in, to be part of something, even if just for a few minutes. That small part made her stomach flutter with a mix of hope and fear. The people around her were talking.
Ow!
About things she barely understood. Names, places, expensive vacations, business deals, and insider jokes swirled around her. She smiled politely when someone glanced her way, but no one lingered. She was invisible by design, and the design had worked. But every invisible person carries a weight, and she felt it pressing down on her chest. She had dreams and talents. Passions she had tucked away because the world often told her they were not important, not suitable, not valuable. She had learned that the quietest people often have the loudest thoughts inside. But the world rarely listened. Her eyes drifted again to the piano. Its polished surface reflected the lights and the faces of the guests, and she felt a strange pull in her chest. Something in her longed to touch it, to feel the keys under her fingers, to make the notes rise and fall in the air. Music had always been her refuge, the place where she felt real, where she felt whole. But here, in this room full of strangers, that part of her life felt distant, almost forbidden. She had learned to hide her talents, to keep them locked away, to survive by being small and quiet. A conversation nearby caught her attention. Two guests were whispering and pointing in her direction. She could not hear the words, but she could feel the judgment. She hugged herself slightly, wishing she had a place to run to, a room where she could disappear completely. Her heart beat faster, her palms grew sweaty. She had been through parties like this before, and she knew how they ended for her, usually in discomfort and regret. She had learned the art of disappearing too well. Yet, she watched the piano. A spark of something else flickered inside her. Fear, yes, but also curiosity. She remembered the feeling of her fingers dancing over keys, the sound of a melody that made her heart lift and her soul soar. That feeling had stayed with her through years of quiet struggles and unnoticed achievements. It reminded her of who she truly was, not the invisible figure standing in the corner, not the one people quietly judged. She was someone who could create beauty, who could touch hearts, even if no one else believed it yet. A soft murmur passed through the room. Someone mentioned that the piano player had not arrived. The guests looked around, puzzled, and a few shrugged as if it were no matter. She felt her heart tighten. This was her chance, but she hesitated. She was not sure she had the courage to step forward, to risk being seen, to risk being wrong. Every part of her screamed that she should stay hidden, that it was safer to remain invisible. And yet another part of her whispered, urging her closer to the piano. She took a small step forward. Then another, her shoes making soft sounds against the polished floor. The room felt both bigger and smaller at the same time. Bigger because the world seemed so full of strangers. Smaller because the pull toward the piano made everything else fade into the background. She paused for a moment, catching her reflection in the glossy surface of the instrument. She looked nervous, unpolished, out of place, but she also saw determination in her eyes. A tiny flame that refused to go out. People continued to move around her, unaware or indifferent. Some glanced curiously. Some shook their heads in subtle disapproval, but she did not stop. She felt her fingers brushing the edge of the keys, cold and smooth, and the familiar thrill of anticipation rose in her chest. This was where she belonged, not in the whispers or the laughter, not in the judgments of strangers, but here, in this moment. With music waiting for her, the first note she imagined was simple, almost timid, but it carried something profound, a message she had kept to herself for years. Her hand hovered over the keys, and she felt the weight of fear and hope pressing together. She did not know what would happen next. She did not know if people would be impressed, if they would laugh, if they would notice at all. All she knew was that she had to play, if only for herself. A deep breath, a quick glance at the crowd, and she pressed the first key. The sound rang out, clear and gentle, breaking through the hum of conversation. A few heads turned, some eyebrows lifted, some faces softened. The note lingered in the air, delicate and honest, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to be heard. She did not stop, did not hesitate. Another note followed, then another, building slowly into a melody that came from somewhere deep inside her. For the first time that night, she felt a strange mixture of fear and freedom. Fear, because she was visible now. Freedom, because she was finally being herself. She could not stop smiling, not because the world approved, but because she felt alive. The music became her voice, and for the first time, she did not need permission to speak. She was no longer the invisible guest in the corner. She was someone who could make a difference, someone who could touch the hearts of strangers without saying a word. And all it took was a single note, a single act of courage. To begin to change everything, she stayed near the piano, her fingers brushing the keys, feeling the smooth surface under her hands. The music had not yet begun to flow from her mind, but the tension in the room had shifted. People around her continued to laugh and talk, but now there were glances that lingered a little longer. Some faces showed curiosity, others surprise, and a few carried a subtle skepticism. She did not care. She focused on the piano and the way it called to her. Her eyes moved around the room. Guests in elegant dresses and tailored suits were grouped together, holding glasses and chatting in low, measured voices. She noticed the small details that she might have overlooked before: the way one woman twisted a strand of her hair, the way a man checked his watch repeatedly, the polite smiles that were not entirely genuine. These were the gesturettes that told stories in the background, stories that the people themselves seemed unaware of. She felt herself studying them, not to judge, but to understand. It was something she had always done, quietly observing the world and the people in it. She had grown used to this distance, watching without being watched, listening without speaking, living in the margins where she could remain safe. But tonight felt different. Something about the energy in the room, the soft warmth of the lights, the presence of the piano, made her pulse quicken. It made her want to reach beyond the safety of her invisibility. She took a small step closer, feeling the piano keys beneath her fingers. They were cold but inviting, and she imagined the sound that could come from them. She imagined music that would reach into the hearts of the people in the room, that would connect with them in ways words could not. Her mind wandered to memories from her past. She remembered evenings spent alone with a simple keyboard, teaching herself to play by listening to songs and copying them note by note. She remembered the quiet moments when she felt free and alive, when her hands moved over the keys and the world fell away. Music had always been her sanctuary, her secret language, but life had made her cautious. Life had taught her to shrink, to remain quiet, to avoid drawing attention. And yet, standing here, she felt a daring spark, a quiet voice inside her saying that it was time to be seen. The guests moved around her, still largely unaware of the tension building near the piano. Conversations flowed in gentle waves, some people laughing softly, others speaking in earnest tones. She noticed the subtle signs of discomfort in a few of the guests: a hand tapping nervously against a glass, a faint frown of impatience. The way some people leaned slightly away from others in conversation. It was an intricate dance of social cues, and she found herself both intrigued and oddly comforted. She had always been an observer, and this party, though overwhelming, felt like a puzzle waiting to be understood. A few moments passed, and she realized she was no longer just observing the crowd. She was absorbing it, feeling the rhythm of the room, sensing the tension and excitement that moved like a tide through the space. The piano seemed to hum beneath her fingers as if it understood the thoughts that lingered in her mind. She closed her eyes for a brief second and imagined herself sitting at the piano, letting her hands glide over the keys, creating notes that would carry through the room. The idea scared her and thrilled her at the same time. She had spent so many years keeping her talent hidden, convinced that the world would not value it. But in this moment, the thought of sharing it, even briefly, filled her with a strange, irresistible energy. She opened her eyes and noticed someone glance in her direction. A slight tilt of the head that suggested curiosity. It was nothing dramatic, but it made her pulse quicken. The room was full of people who did not expect her to take part in their world. And yet here she was, daring to imagine herself stepping forward. The thought made her stomach flutter with nerves and anticipation. She had always lived cautiously, measuring her actions carefully, to avoid embarrassment or rejection. But tonight, she felt a quiet courage rising within her, a willingness to cross the invisible line that separated her from the people around her. The piano seemed to grow warmer beneath her hands as she contemplated the possibility of playing. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, imagining the first notes escaping into the room. The sound was not there yet, but the possibility of it was thrilling. She thought of the stories she could tell with music, the emotions she could convey without a single word. Music was her voice, her identity, her hidden power. And now, for the first time in a long while, she considered the idea that perhaps it could be seen and heard. She shifted slightly, feeling the polished floor beneath her shoes and the soft hum of conversation all around. The distance between her and the piano seemed both immense and insignificant. It was a physical distance, yes. But the greater distance was in her mind, the space between who she was and who she wanted to be. She took a slow breath, feeling the tension in her chest and the rapid beating of her heart. There was fear, certainly, but also excitement. The fear had always been a companion, whispering that she should stay hidden, the excitement was newer. A delicate thread of courage that she had not allowed herself to follow before. The music, she realized, had always been waiting for this moment. She had practiced alone, played in empty rooms, imagined audiences that would never exist. And yet in her mind, the piano was no stranger. It was a friend, a confidant, a voice that could speak for her when she could not. She felt the urge to let it speak now, to fill the room with something real and alive. She pictured the first note ringing out, clear and honest, cutting through the hum of conversation, drawing attention without arrogance, simply because it was beautiful and true. Her gaze swept across the room once more. The guests were still chatting, still moving in their social currents. Some had noticed her, some had not. She could sense the judgments, the expectations, the unspoken questions. And yet, she felt herself stepping out of their shadows, finding a place where she could stand without apology. Music had always been her bridge to the world, and now it seemed to beckon her forward. She imagined the piano responding to her touch, the sound echoing through the room, drawing people in not because of status or wealth, but because of something deeper, something authentic. Her fingers hovered over the keys. The first note, she thought, would be small, tentative, just a whisper in the room. But it would carry something important. It would carry her presence, her courage, her refusal to remain invisible. She imagined the ripple of surprise, the shift in attention, the softening of skeptical faces. She imagined herself not as an outsider, but as someone who could command the room in a way that was quiet, gentle, and real. A deep breath and another glance around the room. The chandeliers sparkled above, the laughter flowed like a gentle river, and the piano waited. The moment hung suspended, filled with possibility and tension. She felt the old patterns of fear and doubt tugging at her mind. But she also felt the new thread of courage tightening in her chest. She had always watched from the edges, and now, for the first time, she considered stepping into the center. She ran her fingers lightly across the keys again, feeling the cold smoothness, the promise of sound that was waiting to emerge. The room seemed to hold its breath. She imagined the music growing, note by note, filling the space with something authentic and true. She imagined people pausing, listening, feeling something unexpected and real. She imagined the invisible line between herself and the world dissolving, if only for a few moments, carried away by the power of sound, and for a long, silent second. She let herself imagine what it would feel like to be seen. Not for appearances, not for wealth or status, but simply for who she was. A human being, with talents, fears, and dreams. A person who had spent too long shrinking, hiding, and pretending not to exist. A person who had the power to create beauty, even in a room that seemed full of walls. She was ready. Not yet to play, but to take the next step, to acknowledge that she could belong in her own way, that her presence mattered. The piano waited, and for the first time that night, she felt a connection to something larger than herself. The music was not just an escape anymore. It was a bridge, a way to reach out, a way to be seen. The thought made her heart beat faster and steadier at the same time. Fear was still there, yes, but it no longer had the power to stop her. Courage had found a small, firm foothold in her chest, and so she stood there, fingers brushing the keys, observing the room, and feeling the quiet strength that had always been inside her. She was no longer just an invisible guest, a shadow in the corner. She was a person who could choose to step forward, who could let the music speak, who could take her place, however briefly, in a world that had seemed too big and unwelcoming. And in that quiet human moment, she felt something shift. The night was still young, the party still in full swing, but she knew that something in her had changed forever. Her fingers hovered over the piano keys. She could feel the cold, smooth surface under her palms, and a strange mixture of fear and excitement twisted in her chest. The room seemed to shrink, the noise fading into the background, leaving her alone with the instrument. The murmurs of the guests and the soft clinking of glasses had become distant, almost unimportant. All that mattered was the music waiting inside her and the possibility that, just for a moment, she could let it free. A small, nervous laugh escaped from someone nearby. She turned her head slightly and saw a few guests watching her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to amusement. It was the first real acknowledgement of her presence. The thought made her stomach twist, but it also fueled a tiny spark of courage. She had spent too long shrinking to nothing. Perhaps tonight she could be seen as she truly was. She placed her hands carefully on the keys and closed her eyes. She imagined the sound she wanted to make the first note, soft and simple, almost a whisper, but full of truth. She pressed the key gently, and the note rang out into the room. It was not loud or showy, just clear and honest, cutting through the dull hum of conversation. A few people paused, glancing in her direction. She felt her heart beat faster, but she did not stop. Another note followed, and then another, tentative but steady. The melody began to grow, moving from one hand to the other, rising and falling like a gentle wave. Her body relaxed into the motion, her fingers finding their rhythm, almost as if they remembered from long ago. She had played in empty rooms countless times, but this was different. Now the sound carried weight. Now it touched ears and hearts that did not know her. She felt a shiver run down her spine as the first waves of music began to reach the people around her. She glanced up, just slightly, and saw that the room had begun to change. Guests who had been laughing or chatting in small clusters had turned their heads. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. Eyes were on her now, and she felt both exposed and alive. For the first time in what felt like forever, she realized that people were listening, truly listening. Not just seeing her as someone out of place. Her fingers moved more confidently across the keys. She allowed the melody to flow, letting her emotions guide the rhythm in the pauses. She thought of all the moments she had spent hiding her talent, all the nights when she had felt invisible,
all the times
she had convinced herself that the world would never care about her music. Those memories gave her strength now. Each note she played was a quiet declaration that she existed, she had something to give, that she mattered. The room was silent now, save for her music. The chandeliers above cast sparkling reflections across polished floors. And in those reflections, she saw the faces of people who had doubted her, who had barely noticed her, now watching in quiet. She noticed the subtle movements, the way someone leaned forward, the way another guest's hand trembled slightly as they set down their glass. Her music had captured attention without words, without effort, simply because it was honest and real. She continued to play, letting the melody unfold naturally. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm, her head moving with the rise and fall of the notes. She was fully absorbed, unaware of time, unaware of the room itself. She was no longer the outsider, no longer the quiet guest in the corner. She was a creator, a voice, a presence that could not be ignored. And the strange thing was, the more she played, the more she felt herself belonging. Not in the way the other guests did, but in her own way. Through her own gift, the music began to take on layers, moving from soft, delicate passages to richer, fuller tones. She let her emotions guide her hands, letting sorrow, joy, hope, and longing mingle in each note. The guests were no longer just spectators. They were participants, carried along by the beauty of something they could not touch, but could feel. Eyes glistened, breaths caught, and a quiet murmur of appreciation began to ripple through the room. She did not notice it at first. She was too lost in the music. But gradually, she became aware of the effect she was having. A man near the corner, who had been checking his watch earlier, now leaned forward, resting his hand on the back of a chair, completely still. A woman nearby pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes moist with emotion. Even the group in the center, who had been exchanging polite jokes, had fallen silent, faces softened, eyes fixed on the piano. The transformation was quiet, but undeniable. The room that had seemed full of judgments and distance had become intimate, connected, alive. She took a deep breath, letting the music guide her, allowing herself to feel the power of the moment. She had played alone so many times, imagining audiences that would never exist, dreaming of moments where her music could matter. And now, here it was. Here she was, creating a moment that was real, immediate, and profoundly human. She felt a warmth spreading through her chest, a sense of purpose and belonging that she had rarely known. The melody shifted again, becoming softer, slower, more reflective. She allowed pauses between notes, letting the silence carry as much meaning as the sound. She imagined the stories of the people around her, the struggles and triumphs, hidden behind polished appearances. Her music reached toward them, gently touching the hidden parts, speaking the things that could not be spoken aloud. She felt a connection, fragile but powerful, and it gave her courage to continue, to deepen the expression in each note. For a long time, she played without interruption. The world outside the piano disappeared, replaced by the rhythm of her fingers, the resonance of the notes, the quiet energy flowing through the room. She was aware of glances, of whispers that had stopped, of hearts opening in ways that were invisible but real. She had never felt so seen, so alive, so present. The music was not just sound. It was her story, her voice, her way of saying without words that she existed, that she mattered. She imagined the future unfolding in that moment, the possibility that this night could mark a turning point, that the people who had underestimated her could now see her in a new light. She felt no arrogance, only quiet certainty. She had earned this moment through years of quiet practice, through patience, its belief in something that few others had acknowledged. The piano had become a bridge between herself and the world, a way to cross the invisible distance that had kept her on the margins as the final notes approached. She felt a mixture of sadness and joy. Sadness that the moment might end, joy that it had existed at all. She allowed the last chord to linger, letting it resonate fully before releasing her hands from the keys. Silence returned, but it was not the same as before. The room felt different, altered by the music, by her presence, by the courage it had taken to step forward. The guests were quiet, looking at her with expressions that ranged from awe to disbelief. Some were smiling softly, some had tears in their eyes, and all had been touched in ways that words could not capture. For the first time, she looked around the room, seeing people not as judges, but as humans, vulnerable and open in their own ways. She realized that the world was not as cold as she had imagined, not as distant. There were hearts that could listen, eyes that could see, and minds that could feel. She had stepped forward, and in doing so, she had created a space where she could belong. Even if only for a fleeting moment, the applause began quietly at first, then grew steadily warm and genuine. She felt her cheeks flush, a mix of embarrassment and pride, but she did not move away. She stayed at the piano, letting the final echoes of the music settle in the air, letting herself absorb the recognition that had been denied for so long. She was still nervous, still aware of the eyes upon her. But now the fear was tempered by a quiet strength, a sense of self that had been awakened. In that moment, she understood something important. Belonging was not about fitting in or wearing the same clothes or laughing at the same jokes. Belonging was about being true to oneself, stepping forward with courage, and sharing the gifts that made one unique. The room, the people, the party itself, had been transformed, not by wealth or status, but by honesty and bravery. She had shown herself, and the world had responded in kind. The first steps had been the hardest. But the reward was beyond anything she had imagined. She had touched hearts, even if just for a moment. She had connected with strangers through something simple, yet profound. She had taken a risk and found that it was worth it. And as she sat there, hands resting lightly on the keys, she realized that this night would stay with her forever. A quiet reminder that courage could create beauty, that presence could demand recognition, and that music could make even the most invisible person felt truly seen. The notes lingered in the air like a gentle tide, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. The music was no longer just sound. It had become a living thing, moving through the room, brushing against hearts, stirring emotions that had been quieted by laughter and conversation. People had stopped talking entirely. Eyes were fixed, mouths slightly open in surprise or awe, and even those who had been skeptical moments before now seemed captivated. She realized the power of what she was doing, and it was intoxicating and humbling all at once. She let her hands glide over the keys, moving with a natural rhythm that came from deep within. The melody was not complicated or showy, but it was honest, full of emotion that could not be faked. Every note carried a piece of her story, her fear, her longing, her hidden joy, and the strength she had found in herself over the years. She thought of the countless hours spent practicing in quiet rooms, imagining an audience that might never exist, and now, here they were, real people. Feeling the music as deeply as she did, the room seemed to shift around her. The laughter that had once filled the corners had quieted into a respectful hush. People had stopped looking at each other, stopped fidgeting, and even the small gestures of vanity checking watches, smoothing hair, adjusting teas had disappeared. She noticed a few people leaning slightly forward, eyes glistening, as if they were listening not just with their ears but with their hearts. The music had found a way past the surface, past the polite masks everyone wore, and it had touched something human, something raw and real. Her fingers moved with confidence now, carrying the melody through gentle rises and falls. She felt the music expanding beyond her, reaching the corners of the room, settling into the spaces where conversation and judgment had previously held sway. A soft gasp came from someone at the back, almost inaudible, and she felt a shiver run through her. The realization that she could make this impact, that she could create a moment of connection, was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had been invisible for so long, but now she was undeniably present. The melody began to change, taking on layers of complexity, not because she wanted to impress, but because the emotion demanded it. A soft sorrow intertwined with hope, a quiet longing with gentle triumph. She allowed herself to feel deeply, letting the music carry her own vulnerability into the room. The guests were no longer merely watching. They were participating in something intangible, a shared human experience that transcended words and social status. Each note became a thread connecting them, and she could sense the shift in the energy around her. A man who had been chatting quietly with another guest now sat forward on the edge of a chair, eyes fixed on her hands as they moved across the keys. A woman near the piano clasped her hands together, a faint tremor betraying the emotion the melody had stirred within her. Even the group in the center, who had been exchanging light jokes and polite smiles, were silent now, their expressions softened, their focus wholly on the music. The atmosphere of the room had transformed from casual festivity to a quiet reverence. All because of the courage of one person willing to share her gift. She let her thoughts drift for a moment, remembering the times she had doubted herself, the nights when she felt too small, too invisible to matter. She had lived through years of quiet struggle, moments when fear had held her back from stepping into the world. And now, here she was, breaking through those fears, her music creating a bridge where she had once felt only walls. The realization made her chest tighten, a mix of relief, pride, and the raw joy of being fully herself. Her hands continued their gentle dance across the keys, creating a melody that moved like water through the room. The guests seemed almost entranced, caught in the flow of sound and emotion. She noticed the small details, the way one person leaned slightly closer, the way another wiped a quiet tear from their cheek, the subtle nods of appreciation from people who had been skeptical just moments ago. Each reaction, small though it might have been, fueled her confidence, reassuring her that this moment, these notes, were reaching them. They were seeing her finally, for who she truly was. The music swelled, carrying with it a quiet power. She allowed herself to feel the fullness of the room. It's the weight of the attention, the beauty of the connection she was forging. The party, with all its elegance and chatter, had shifted entirely. No longer was it a collection of strangers performing social rituals. It had become a space where emotion and human experience were shared openly, carried by sound that needed no explanation. She felt humbled and honored. Aware that something fragile and extraordinary was happening, she let the melody take on a playful quality, soft and bright, inviting smiles and lightness back into the room. People shifted subtly, some leaning toward one another, sharing glances that carried unspoken thoughts. The music had become a shared language, a bridge over the divisions of status, wealth, and pretense. She could sense the joy spreading through the room, the way it lifted shoulders and brightened faces. And yet, it remained personal and intimate, as if each note had a unique message for each listener. For a long stretch, she played without thought, allowing instinct and emotion to guide her. Every sound was deliberate yet effortless, conveying a sincerity that resonated deeply. She felt herself becoming one with the piano, a conduit for emotion and presence. The energy in the room had shifted completely. The guests were no longer spectators in a performance, but participants in a human experience they had not expected to encounter at a fancy party. They were connected by something beyond words. Drawn together by the simple honesty of her music, she noticed how the music was changing the way people interacted. Conversations that had seemed trivial now held a quiet depth. Gestures were more gentle, and smiles carried warmth rather than mere politeness. She realized that music had the power to reach beyond appearances, beyond judgment, to touch the core of what it meant to be human. She had spent so long hiding her own humanity, her talents, her presence, and now she saw the profound impact of revealing them. Her fingers moved with growing confidence, dancing lightly across the keys, bringing out harmonies and subtle shifts in tempo. She allowed the melody to rise and fall naturally, letting pauses carry emotion as much as the notes themselves. A quiet hush had settled over the room. The usual rustling and shifting of feet had ceased. She could feel the pulse of the audience, the way their attention flowed with her music, the silent communication that passed from one person to another. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced in that moment. She understood a truth she had never fully grasped. Courage and authenticity could transform the world around her. It did not require grandeur or performance, only honesty and the willingness to share what was inside. She had been invisible for so long, but by choosing to play, to step forward, she had created a ripple that reached far beyond herself. She realized that moments of real human connection were rare and precious, and she had created one here simply by being brave enough to be herself. The melody softened, slowing slightly, becoming reflective and gentle. She allowed herself to breathe, to feel the emotions that had guided her hands, to absorb the reactions of those around her. A sense of calm settled over the room, a quiet intimacy that seemed impossible just moments ago. She noticed a few people with tears glistening in their eyes, hands pressed to chests, faces softened in contemplation. Her music had touched them in ways words could not. She paused for a brief moment, resting her hands lightly on the keys, letting the silence speak. The room was still, filled with the echoes of what had been played. She felt the warmth of recognition, the acknowledgement that she had been seen and heard. Not as a guest or an outsider, but as a human being with something to offer. The courage it had taken to reach this moment was immense, but the reward was beyond measure. She had created a space where the barriers between herself and others had dissolved, replaced by shared emotion and presence. The music began again, soft and flowing, weaving through the room, inviting smiles, tears, and silent reflection. She noticed the subtle shifts in the audience, the way people leaned toward one another, how their expressions had changed, how the room felt lighter, warmer, and more alive. Her music was no longer just a melody. It was a bridge, a shared experience that transformed not just her, but everyone present. She realized that this was the moment she had been waiting for, even if she had not known it. The courage to step forward, to take her place, to let the music speak for her, had opened a door she had thought permanently closed. She had belonged all along, not by fitting in, not by mimicking the world around her, but by being true to herself and sharing her gift. The piano, the room, the people, they were all part of a living, breathing experience, and she was at its center, fully alive and fully present. The notes lingered in the air, echoing softly, carrying with them the emotions, courage, and humanity that had guided them. She felt a profound sense of satisfaction, quiet joy that arose from creating something beautiful, honest, and transformative. The room had changed, and she had changed with it. She had discovered that courage, honesty, and the willingness to share what is hidden inside can create connections that last far beyond the final note. And as she continued to play, she knew that this night, this moment would stay with her forever. a reminder of the power that lies in stepping forward and being truly seen. She lifted her hands from the keys for a moment, letting the final notes of her melody fade into the quiet hum of the room. The silence that followed was deep and almost sacred. She could feel eyes on her, not the curious or skeptical glances from before, but something warmer, more attentive, almost reverent. The air seemed to hold its breath, as though the room itself had stopped to recognize what had just happened. She had expected some polite applause, a murmur of approval, or maybe a few polite nods. But what she found instead was something far more powerful: recognition that came not from status or wealth, but from the human connection her music had created. Her chest swelled with a mixture of relief, pride, and disbelief. She had played with nothing but honesty, nothing but the desire to express herself and connect. And now the world had responded. She had never felt anything like it, never been acknowledged in this way. All the years of hiding, of shrinking, of convincing herself that her presence did not matter, they were all swept away in a single unbroken moment of shared humanity.